Many experts on military strategies agree on one thing, that retaking Crimea is the absolute key to the end of this horrible Russian war in Ukraine. Would you join them in this conclusion?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Crimea is the decisive terrain of this war. As long as Russia continues to illegally occupy Crimea, they will continue to attack Ukraine's 5 seaports or block access to their ports. Even after Mariupol and Berdyansk are liberated, Russia on Crimea will still block access into Sea of Azov. So not only will it guarantee continued strikes from Russia, it will also make it impossible for Ukraine to rebuild their economy, which means that nations or private investors will not want to put money into Ukraine's rebuilding. So Crimea is so important, not just for political or emotional reasons, but for practical economic reasons.
We have seen during mid-September some spectacular Ukrainian attacks on the Crimean Peninsula, hitting Russian warships and missiles. How would you rate the possibility of recapturing the peninsula, the territory?
It's absolutely very doable. The amount of time it takes really depends on the United States and on Germany. My president, who has done a great job of helping to keep 50 nations together, focused on helping Ukraine, has stopped short of saying, we want Ukraine to win. If he was to say, we want Ukraine to win, then there would be no more excuses about providing ATACMS or other long-range systems that would help Ukraine make the Crimean Peninsula untenable. And I believe that the German government would follow suit immediately with their Taurus if the United States would make that kind of a decision about ATACMS. Now, the strikes that Ukraine has been able to launch against Crimea demonstrates the value and effectiveness of this approach. I mean, using what they have, plus Storm Shadow that they received from UK, they've launched a very, very sophisticated, multi-dimensional attack against Crimea. Commando raids first to destroy radar, then commando raids to see the oil and gas platforms out in the Black Sea on which the Russians had placed radar. And then they're able to launch drones and missiles against the dry dock in Sevastopol. This is a level of sophistication that almost nobody else is capable of doing. And this is part of the reason I feel optimistic about Ukraine's chances to isolate Crimea, make it untenable for Russian forces, and then eventually liberate it.
Would you say that if Russians lose this territory, it would be the ultimate defeat for them in the war they started back in 2014?
I think it would be very, very difficult for Russia to continue as if nothing had happened if they lose Crimea, when they lose Crimea. For all the reasons I mentioned already, what Crimea does for them in the Black Sea region, as well as against Ukraine, obviously there would be some sort of an impact inside of Russia. I mean, Putin has made so much about Crimea, but I think that how Russians might react to the loss of Crimea is overestimated. I was in Georgia 2 weeks ago and visiting Tbilisi. There's over 100,000 Russian military-age males hiding in Georgia, not because they're against Putin, but because they don't want to be conscripted. They don't want to get sent to Ukraine to fight. And there are hundreds of thousands of other Russian military-age males that left the country rather than be conscripted and sent to fight in Ukraine. So while the Putin at the top and his closest ring around him may talk a lot about Crimea, I think most Russians, other than going there for holiday, they're not willing to fight for it. So I think we should not deter ourselves from helping Ukraine to liberate Crimea.
when we talk more about the, let's say, the current state of the troops or potential troops, how many troops would you say Ukraine has, and maybe Russia too, because that's important, of course?
Yeah, this is an important question, but I don't know the exact numbers. Of course, I don't believe any number that comes out of Russia. And there's so many different types of forces. You've got the regular army, the professionals, you have conscripts, you have mobilized reserves, you've got, you know, there were many other mercenary companies, private military companies besides Wagner, and we still don't know exactly what Wagner's status is, although it looks like it's being absorbed into the Ministry of Defense. So it's hard to say. And then you have the National Guard and other interior forces. What I do feel pretty confident about is that Russia is in a very, very difficult manpower situation, partly because of the 500,000 men who left the country, as I've already mentioned, rather than be conscripted. And these were the ones that were clever enough to get out of there. Russia tends to pull conscripts from the eastern regions of the country. Moscow and St. Petersburg have not had to provide too many people yet, because obviously that would create domestic problems inside those two countries. But I've heard where President Putin said that he was concerned that there are not enough people working in defense industry. So that tells you, you know, they have a serious manpower drain. I don't think you could fill up a classroom with the number of Russians who really want to be fighting in Ukraine. So there's a real problem for them. We see that they are grabbing recent immigrants, refugees, and pushing them into the military as well. And obviously, these soldiers are not well trained. I mean, they literally are cannon fodder that are being pushed in there to the fight. On the Ukrainian side, of course, they started off with a population that's about 1/3 the size of Russia. The huge difference here, despite the enormous casualties that Ukrainian forces are suffering, these soldiers are defending their homeland. And so there is concern, of course, that they've lost so many people, soldiers. I think that there are a lot of women who are prepared to fight. So we may see an increase in the number of women who enter the armed forces. But for now, I would say if it comes down to a matter of attrition, Ukraine will still have an advantage because they are defending their homeland.
Which is, I'm just thinking about the position of women in the army, which is not really common for Russia, right? There are only men, I would say.
They do have women in the military, but you don't see women being employed in the combat roles the way that you have seen in Ukraine. I'm sure that there are women somewhere, but other than at parades and in administrative or staff functions, I just haven't seen evidence that there are women being employed the way that they are in the U.S. military or most NATO countries, where you find women in the infantry, artillery, and aviation engineers, as well as the more traditional administrative or medical functions.
Let's talk more about the current state of the offensive or counteroffensive. It differs. We use different names for it. Actually, what do you use for the...
That's a great question. It is a counteroffensive, and it's important to use that terminology. I'm glad you asked that, Linda, because there are attempts to create a narrative that somehow, you know, Russia's on the defense and that Ukraine is threatening Russia, that NATO is using Ukraine to threaten Russia. So to be correct, but also to counter the Russian narrative of who's the aggressor here and who's defending their homeland, what Ukraine is doing is a counteroffensive. Now, a counteroffensive is a joint, multi-faceted, multi-dimensional operation that involves land forces, air forces, naval forces, special forces, cyber, information, a whole variety of activities that are integrated together to achieve the objective. I believe that the objective of Ukraine's counteroffensive is to liberate Crimea. The ground portion appears to be aimed at, number one, regaining control of Zaporizhzhia, the nuclear power plant, but also to sever the land bridge, the logistics route that goes from continental Russia at Rostov down along the Azov coast through Mariupol, Melitopol, and into Crimea. So if you can sever that, Crimea looks very, very vulnerable. The only other land route, of course, is the famous Kerch Bridge, which you've already seen to be very vulnerable. But you've got drone strikes that are happening several times a week, hitting or interfering with Russian commercial air traffic. Airports around Moscow and other cities have to shut down whenever drones are reported for obvious reasons. This has a significant economic impact, as well as being disruptive, especially in a country the size of Russia that requires commercial air traffic to do a lot of different things. The commando raids on Crimea that I mentioned earlier, sabotage that is happening throughout the Russian-occupied parts of Ukraine, and then the very clever focus on destroying Russian artillery and the logistics. All of these things are part of the counteroffensive, not just the part that we see and hear the most, which is soldiers going through minefields, trenches, which, of course, that's going slower than any of us would want. But I would just say, as you educate your viewers, to step back from the minefields and trenches and think more broadly about what is a counteroffensive, what is it trying to accomplish. The Ukrainians are on their timeline. When we say it's going too slow, that's because we're impatient, and we're thousands of miles away. Ukrainians, they know what the weather is, they know the geography, they know what they have. And the last thing I would say, the Ukrainian general staff is very, very disciplined. They protect information in a very professional way. So we don't know. We are not entitled to know exactly what they have, where they are, those kinds of things. So I'm impressed that the Ukrainian general staff is running rings around the Russian general staff, putting enormous pressure on a very weak and fragile Russian command structure.